Chapter 6. Rest is on the way. Starved for Sabbath. I find it fitting and even beautiful to end a chapter by encouraging action and movement and begin the next one by encouraging rest and refreshment. Because if we want to be nourished, we need a rhythm that includes both. I'd like to tell you I have this one figured out, and I am the expert to guide you into soul rest and Sabbath practice. Truth be told, this one isn't easy for me. I am naturally prone to striving and averse to resting. As with any and all of these practices, I am fumbling forward. I am a fellow pilgrim. I am a recovering approval addict. I am a busy bee by nature. I am a people pleaser who is continually unraveling the message that my worth is enmeshed in my performance. I was born with a playful, creative, adventurous ADHD nature. My family affectionately called me a space cadet in the 80s, though I am now second-guessing the affection in this. I had ideas, and I made art, and I wrote in my journal all the time, and my room was a disaster. I was a tornado of creativity and achievement. Naturally, I started a soap carving business when I was in the 3rd grade. My amazing dad invested in this business and bought my best friend and me a 24-pack of ivory bar soap to carve. We carved one bar that looked like a mangled sea turtle. Bless his heart, bless ours. Needless to say, the rest of the soap was inconspicuously shoved under our beds for 2 solid years. After our soap carving aspirations collapsed, I dreamed of hosting my own talk show like Oprah. I saw it as an avenue for doing 2 things I loved, entertaining others and doing very important world-changing work. Even though these dreams for one reason, to be loved, even though my heart was in the right place, I found myself dreaming these dreams for one reason, to be loved. I was entertaining to be loved. I was performing to be loved. I was trying to prove that I was capable and, in turn, lovable. I didn't know this at the time, of course. I couldn't have told you that was why I was filling my schedule to the brim. I liked being involved in several sports and found a great deal of identity there. I liked holding important positions at school and youth group. I saw leadership qualities emerge and grow in me there. I liked being liked, and don't we all? I thought I was staying busy and being productive in order to chase my dreams and make an impact. But in reality, I was staying busy and productive so others would know that I was important. The more responsible we are, the more responsibility we'll receive. If we seem to carry it all so well, then others will pile on more, if we let them. After growing up as a childhood achiever, I inadvertently led the world to believe I could take it all on and do it well. That pattern continued into my early adult years, and eventually I found myself becoming resentful of people's unrealistic expectations of me, as if they were the problem. Anger simmered below the surface each time people asked more from me. I was trying to keep my appearance well balanced, keep my family well ordered, and corral the chaotic house clutter into its place. The salient space I forgot, my own starving soul. A cover-up. Managing other people's expectations and opinions is not only exhausting, it is soul-depleting. When we carry others' opinions, our arms aren't freed to do the work we were created to do. When we listen to other people's voices, our souls can't hear our own song. When we fill our calendars with busyness, we leave no room for the deep, peaceful rest our souls really need to survive. Why do we do that? Why don't we rest? What keeps us needing to be so busy? Why do we just keep going and filling up our calendars? Why are we always hurrying and running our kids ragged while we're busy proving we're actually very important? Why is it so hard to trust that resting is good, that it's actually a nourishing act of faith? Because busy is safe, busy is meaningful, busy is important, busy is an identity, and busy covers up fear. Fear can be a scout for us if we choose to listen to her. Fear helps us ask some pretty good questions if we can give honest answers. What am I afraid will happen if I just stop? If I create a rhythm that intentionally includes rest? if I take the time in silence to renew my mind? What do I fear if I say no to this next project? What am I scared will happen if I just let go of opinions and expectations? What fears is my busyness trying to cover up? I'm afraid I won't be worth anything. I'm afraid I won't be necessary. I'm afraid if I don't keep everything running smoothly at high speed, then I won't matter. I'm afraid I have to run the world to be important in it. I'm afraid I won't be needed by anyone. I'm afraid I won't like what I find in the quiet. I'm afraid I won't be loved and admired. I'm afraid I won't find fulfillment. I'm afraid I won't know who I am without the busy. This is a lot to carry, an exhausting load. I'm tired just thinking about it. I imagine your confessions might sound the same, because for so many of us, busyness is a cover-up of the fear of exposing who we really are without our schedules, our achievements, our accolades, and our ability to meet everyone's needs and expectations perfectly. But busy is leaving us more than just tired and afraid. Deep down, it's leaving us hungry. In all that busyness, we don't find satisfaction. Ultimately, we just find starvation. That's because busy certainly isn't a fruit of the Spirit. In fact, keeping in step with the Spirit may not look like busyness at all. As Paul tells us, the result of walking alongside the Spirit of God looks like this: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. See Galatians 5, verses 22 and 23. I don't know about you, but when I am so busy being busy, my life doesn't look much like any of these things. I mostly just feel afraid. That's when it's helpful to remember that God has not given us a spirit of fear. So if the only fruit we're producing is stale and afraid, maybe it's time to check which spirit we're walking with. Is it the spirit who produces life-giving fruit, or the spirit whose fruit starves us for more? A rhythm of rest. When God created everything in the very good beginning, he worked for 6 days. And in those 6 days, he literally made everything: light and oceans and creatures and sky and night and humans in his image. Basically, God was busy. But then, on the 7th day, something different happened. Then God rested. But this wasn't just some measly nap. It wasn't just clearing his schedule to have some time off. It wasn't a veg out of the couch and watch Netflix kind of thing. This was real, deep, soul-nourishing rest. It was blessed rest, set apart rest, holy rest. There's a rhythm here, a pattern at play that God himself participated in to show us the way. He made mountains and brought beauty and orchestrated oceans for 6 straight days. He literally did it all. And then he rested. Work, then rest. That's the rhythm God created the world with. It's the pattern he laid out for us to follow in our own spiritual lives. Work, then rest. What's crazy to think about here is the fact that God is God, and in that, God doesn't actually need rest. God is limitless and all-powerful. Nothing is too hard for him. See Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 17. He does not get tired. See Isaiah chapter 40, verses 28 and 31. He does not slumber and watches over us when we do. See Psalm 121, verses 3 and 4. He never runs out of energy, out of sustainability, out of himself. So if God doesn't need the rest, why did he take it? He clearly made a deliberate choice to rest, a choice made out of love for us. By setting the Sabbath apart from the beginning, God established a rhythm of work and rest for us to implement in our own lives, a pattern of sweat and trust for us to follow. We see this rhythm play out again and again and again in God's Word. In fact, it's so valuable to him that it was built into the 10 Commandments given to Moses. It's the 4th commandment, and it's serious business. And as humans tend to do, if something feels religiously serious, we really make sure we get it right. We make more laws around the law to make sure the law is super lawful. We all do this. We make these little rules in our hearts to try to ensure that we can check off the God box. We make little spiritual deals in our hearts. If we shouldn't have sex before we're married, I am not kissing until the altar. If we don't want our brother to stumble, we are going to only wear one-piece swimsuits and definitely not spaghetti straps. If we shouldn't get drunk, we will never ever set foot in a bar. You get the picture. The Sabbath was soon so bogged down with extra tiny rules on how to keep it set apart, God's people seemed to have forgotten about the heart, the rhythm behind the command. It wasn't about the 39 clarifications added to this command, including no kneading, tying, untying, reaping, plowing, or baking. Baking is one of my favorite things to do on the Sabbath, by the way. The heart behind the Sabbath is in the rhythm it gives us for life. It's so much more than a command. It's a gift. The Sabbath is grace to us, one God knew we would need. It's a gift that encourages us to walk in His rhythm and to trust Him to provide when we do. The practice of rest. When I first started reading about the good gift of the Sabbath, I felt really overwhelmed. A whole entire day of not working, of not preparing for the next week, of not getting ahead or catching up. I have so much to do. How could I possibly stop for even a moment, let alone an entire day? In that season, I found great comfort and encouragement from Marva Dawn in her book, Keeping the Sabbath Holy. She writes, setting aside a holy Sabbath means that we can cease our productivity and accomplishments for one day in every 7. The exciting thing about such a practice is that it changes our attitudes for the rest of the week. It frees us up to worry less about how much we produce on the other days. I desperately need to keep Sabbaths faithfully so that this attitude can increasingly pervade the rest of my days. Ceasing productivity and accomplishment for an entire day once seemed like only a dream. To be honest, it seemed impossible. Are we really allowed to do that? Dawn says yes, and more importantly, God says yes. So we can say yes too. Friend, not only are we allowed to rest, but God encourages us to rest. God encourages us to lay down our efforts and identity tied to productivity every 7 days. God encourages us to find nourishment for our tired, starving souls in our rest. Don calls this a practice, and I think that's right. Over the past 15 years, the practice of a Sabbath has brought such spiritual nourishment in my life, but I had to give myself room to figure it out. As with any practice, it takes time. We have to train for it. We start small and build up. And of course, we're going to get it wrong a time or two. Every good practice includes both the learning and the falling on repeat. But the practice is worth it. The practice is what gets us there. I need to continue to learn that I am not the sum of my accomplishments. I need to remind myself constantly that my worth is not tied to my productivity. I need to make rest a practice in my life to remember what really feeds my soul. I think the same is true for you, friend. After all, we are human beings, not human doings. That means we are loved and valuable simply by being. When we create space to rest, we simply be. We are creating space to allow God to speak that reminder over us. Our society is thirsty for the good and holy practice of setting aside our own work and resting in God's acceptance of us through the cross. That's the real rest. That's soul rest. There we can be loved, held, and enjoyed by Jesus. There we can allow His face to shine upon us. There we can untangle our identity from our work and place it in being God's. There we can be nourished. Recently, I found myself so depleted one afternoon in the middle of the week, I was looking at a to-do list a mile long, at the top of which was my sermon for our church service that coming Sunday. It was one of those moments where I needed to just trust God, surrender to the fatigue, and lie down for a few minutes. In the past, I would have done the exact opposite. I would have made every attempt to run through that list with all kinds of busyness and frenzy. I would have written a hurried sermon under the stress of performing, and it likely would have been terrible. But this was the new me, the me who'd made rest a practice in my life. So instead of going, I stopped. I rested quite literally. When I woke up after a 20-minute power nap, I had 3 points in my mind to go with the scripture I was teaching on that week. Still groggy, I wrote those down and gave myself permission to take my time waking up. Then, the following day, I sat down to write my sermon, and I couldn't believe how easily it seemed to come together. In my rest, God led me. He gave me the outline for exactly what I needed to teach just a few days later. While I rested, God provided. And friend, I believe He will do the same for you. He's given us the rhythm of rest to nourish our souls. He's asked us to trust Him to care for us in the being rather than the doing. He's asked us to make rest a practice in our lives. If rest is an act of trust, then let it open our eyes and hearts to trust that God loves to provide for us in our faith. The manna. So how do we begin this journey? How do we start practicing trusting God to sustain His world and to provide for us? How do we Sabbath? We remember the manna. In Exodus 16, God hears the Israelites grumbling about their hunger in the desert. In response, God promises to rain down bread from heaven for them each morning to provide for their needs. He instructs them to gather up an omer, about 3 pounds, for each person for the day. No more, no less. If they tried to save it for later or hoard it for themselves, it would have been maggot infested by the next day. That's some really fresh bread God is providing, huh? So fresh it's intended to eat within the day. This manna, the daily bread, was a call to trust God's daily provision. The Israelites needed to trust that each morning God would provide new, fresh bread. They didn't need to hoard or store up for themselves. They just needed to trust and remember that God had it covered each day. And here's the kicker. On the Sabbath, their sacred day of rest, God promised to do more. The day before the Sabbath, God promised to provide twice as much so that the Israelites wouldn't need to go out and gather on the actual day of rest. They didn't have to do anything to provide for themselves that day. God gave them more simply so they could rest. The idea of a Sabbath could have been just as frightening to the Israelites as it can be for us. In our efficiency-obsessed, productivity-driven, and capitalistic culture, it's daunting to think about putting it all down simply to rest. In our world, we simply aren't supposed to be able to handle not doing anything. Though times have changed a lot since the days of wandering in the desert, I imagine the Israelites might have felt the same way. Can you imagine the other cultures around them working hard, farming, and gathering food for themselves all the time? Then God tells them to do the opposite, to rest for an entire day each week, to let Him take care of it all. It was essentially asking them to take a major trust fall each and every week. And honestly, it's the same for us. No, we're not looking for God to drop literal manna from the sky each day to meet our physical needs, but we are looking to Him to provide the spiritual manna, the daily bread we need to satiate our souls, and that isn't easy to do all the time. If you're anything like me, you look for the manna, but you do so with a question in your heart. If God is truly God, is He big enough to be God when we do nothing to provide for ourselves? That question is real, and that's hard. If we practice a day of rest, we have to ask that question, and we have to answer it honestly. Then we can remember the manna. We can practice trusting God in our rest. We can remember that He is good, He is God, and He will provide. I could give you story after story of how trusting God yielded better fruit than my own toil could have ever produced. There was the time my husband was out of town, but I still chose to Sabbath on my own. I woke up from an afternoon nap, yes, while my kids played Minecraft, to a myriad of texts. I was scheduled to speak at a college ministry's weekly meeting in just 2 days, and they were asking about my PowerPoint notes. Normal stuff, right? Well, Usually I'd say yes, but in this case, not so much, because somehow this particular speaking event was not on my calendar. This was all news to me. I had planned on taking the whole day to rest, but those text messages changed the plan. Suddenly, besides single parenting all week, I was now also scrambling to have something to present. I was completely blindsided and immediately overwhelmed. I sat straight up and scurried to find my computer and started brainstorming for my talk. And in that moment, I had a face-off with my own heart. Do I trust God to provide for me in this, or do I trust myself and get to work? If I keep resting, keep choosing what is good for my soul in this moment, will God actually provide the time, the resources, the energy, and the ideas tomorrow? Shouldn't I use the time I have right now to put this together? I looked at the assigned topic one more time. This time it triggered something. A blog post I had recently written. Wait a minute. Wasn't that title of their series the exact title of my post? Had I written this thing already and didn't know it? Did God provide for me already? Yes. I pulled up my blog. This was the exact thing the students were asking to hear about at their meeting. It was all set. I had already written exactly what they needed, and God knew it all along. Psalm 139 rang in my ears. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Verse 16. God knew about my struggle to Sabbath and to trust Him before this moment came to be. He provided for me way before I needed it, like the manna for 2 days for the Israelites. We must remember the manna when we try to replace our busyness with rest. We must remember that God will provide. Prepare for the Sabbath. We must also remember how Jesus handled the Sabbath. True to his character, Jesus did good things on the Sabbath. There were several healings and miracles that Jesus performed specifically on the Sabbath. Of course, the religious leaders of the day were furious when this happened, because the Sabbath was buried under rules and more laws. They missed that the Sabbath was about God and His goodness, and according to Jesus, goodness included healing. On one Sabbath, Jesus was in the synagogue. There, he met a man with a withered hand. Looking to bring charges against Jesus, the Pharisees asked him if it was lawful to heal on the Sabbath. He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Matthew chapter 12, verses 11 and 12. Then Jesus completely restored this man's hand. The religious leaders were so concerned about what not to be doing on the Sabbath that they missed the good they could be doing. Haven't we been there too? I know I have. I've certainly been so concerned with not doing the wrong thing that I missed the good and right thing. This often happens when I am concentrating on God's rules, believing He's out to smite me, instead of concentrating on God's love for me, believing He's out to provide for me. In the former, I find more starvation, but in the latter, I find satisfaction. To help me get my mind around what is good and helpful for me to do on the Sabbath, I've learned to actually take the time to prepare for the Sabbath. As we often rest on Sundays, I'll use my Saturdays to get my week in order, to get chores done, to get groceries, to do laundry. But when darkness is near on Saturday night, I try to put all signs of work away. My computer, the broom, my to-do list, it all goes away. It gives me room to remember and rest. In our family, we've also gone through phases of lighting 2 candles to start the Sabbath. Traditionally, one candle symbolizes remembering the Sabbath and the other observing, as stated in Exodus 20, verse 8, and Deuteronomy 5, verse 12. This practice is an outward symbol to remind us of the inward nourishment our souls will find in the rhythm of rest God created us for. So consider what this might look like for you. What does your Sabbath look like, and how can you start preparing your heart, your mind, your family, your home to find rest? I've heard it said, if you work with your hands during the week, then use your mind during the Sabbath. If you work with your mind, then use your hands. Maybe that framework would be a helpful place for you to start. Remember, rest looks different for all of us. This can mean any number of things depending on what truly quiets and calms your soul. Rest from comparison. Believe that God delights in you. You don't need to look like anyone else. He made you on purpose. Rest from screens. Put away your phone and get outside. Rest from work. Do something you've been wanting to do just for soul pleasure. Rest from hustle. Refuse to make a to-do list and take a nap. Rest from a scarcity mindset. Embrace the abundance God has given you and be generous to specific people. Rest from productivity. Have people over for a meal and linger. No agenda required. Rest from self-focus. Look for God. Rest in Him. Look for His gifts, His beauty, His love for you and others. Rest from complaining. Find a real pen and actual paper and write 10 things you are thankful for. Rest from self-sufficiency. Trust God to double your time and provide for you while you rest. But friend, let me urge you here again to resist adding rules to your rest. We want to take a day to practice remembering God, our provider. This is not about getting it right. It's about knowing and loving God and letting Him nourish our tired and weary souls. It is about resting in the work Jesus did on the cross so we would be accepted by Him. It is about celebrating that no other work or pushing or proving makes us acceptable and loved by Him. It's about doing what's good for you and for others in that time. Eugene Peterson tells us, if we do not regularly quit work for 1 day a week, we take ourselves far too seriously. I love the rhythm of work and rest and the ancient Sabbath goodness we can learn from it. Literally write it into your calendar and tell everyone you are booked solid during that time. You are busy resting. You are busy trusting in the Lord. You are busy finding nourishment for your soul. A practice. Plan to rest. Look at your calendar for the next week and block out a few hours or a whole day to Sabbath. What does your heart need in order to Sabbath? Do you need nature? Do you need a nap? Do you need to put away some things? Do you need a babysitter for your kids? Take the time to be intentional about your plan to rest. A prayer. Part of Sabbath is trusting God, trusting that He is good and He will provide for you when you rest. Open your Bible and read the verses below aloud as a prayer, asking God to help you remember who He is. Nothing is too hard for Him. He does not get tired. He does not slumber. Close by praying, God, I am worthy of rest. This is the rhythm you created for me. Help me to remember that when I rest, you will always provide what I need.